Okay, let's take a look at some of the filters and techniques used in order to animate various lines and strokes inside of After Effects. So the first one I'm going to use is stroke. I'm using my Lines After Effects project here, and the first composition window is open. It's called 01 Stroke. And what we're going to do is animate a line around a map that shows the direction of this bike race that we're creating a graphic for over here. So if I just scroll through my timeline, you can see that around about each second through the animation, we have a different town marker appear in the map. And then we get towards the final 2 seconds and we reach the finish point over there. So what we're going to do is try and animate a line between each of these and show you the quickest way to do it. So before I do that, first thing we need to do is have a layer to which we can apply the line. So I'll just go to the layer menu and create new solid. Now it's worth noting the shortcut used on this, which is Command Y or Control Y on the PC, because we're going to be using this particular option many times throughout these demonstrations. So we'll be referencing shortcuts rather than anything else. Another thing to note out is the layer settings underneath, which is actually used to control the color and size of a solid once it's been created. And you see the shortcut for this is Shift Command Y or Shift Control Y on the PC. So do remember those two because we will be using them a lot. So I'm quickly going to go to New Solid. And in the dialog box that comes up, I'll just click on Make Comp Size and just ensure it's all exactly the right size I need. And I can leave it black for now and just click OK. And you'll see that drops a solid down into our composition window. Now we're going to add our effect to it. If I go to my Effect menu up here, I'm going to go all the way down to Render and then go almost to the bottom and choose Stroke. Okay, and my Stroke Effect dialog box comes up. Come back to the Comp window. Let's just move this into place over here. And you'll see that we have a bunch of settings in here for our stroke. And if I just go ahead and drag up the stroke size, you'll notice that we're not actually seeing anything at all at this point. There's a reason for that. The stroke filter only works with certain options. It doesn't work with position keyframe data. So let's say we were to animate this layer moving around. We couldn't select that data and actually turn it into a stroke. We also don't have an option to do manual positioning. Say take a center point and just plot different courses throughout the layer to which we can apply the stroke. The way that it works out is with a mask. You see here I have a mask option or a path option, and it's asking me to find a mask somewhere in my layer, which I don't actually have right now. So I'm going to use a mask that I do have stored. And for this, I'm going to go across into Illustrator and go to Open. And in the content folder for this particular lesson, we have an Illustrator file called Illustrator Root. It's got a tinted map in the background, which is the same one we're using in After Effects, but I've also got a path that's drawn over the top. So just click Open, go ahead and open that. And you can see our graphic here. Now, we're obviously not going to copy the map. It was just used for position values only. Now, if you don't have Illustrator, you could either draw the path inside of Adobe Photoshop or even draw it directly inside of After Effects using the masking techniques that we covered in the earlier program. And of course, you can always go back and review that. What I'm going to do is just select the mask here with my selection tool and press Command C or Control C to copy it into memory. I did point this out earlier in the masking sections of the training, where it's important that you check your Illustrator preferences are set to Illustrator Clipboard for when you're copying and pasting between applications. Don't make the mistake of leaving it on PDF, so do double check that. Again, let's just press Command C and then I'll switch back over into After Effects. And we still have our layer selected here, and if I just hit Command V and paste, you'll see that our mask comes in on top of our layer here. Now, it's obviously not getting rid of the background pixels. That's because the mask is open. Again, referring back into the mask section that we've been through already, the open masks will not mask out the background. Now, another shortcut we'll use a fair amount is because we've got a lot of masks here and the detail is quite fine, I want to hide this selection area so we can see just the effects we're working on. Keyboard shortcut for that on the Mac is Shift Command H, or on the PC Shift Control H, and you'll see that my background selection disappears, but it is still active. Okay, you can see that my Effect Controls window is up. And in my timeline, solid 1 is still highlighted. So it's just a way of showing and hiding the edges. And again, this is another shortcut we will use a lot throughout the training. So if we just come back up to the comp window here and come back to the path menu, we now have mask 1 available because we've pasted in a mask. So I'm just going to choose that. And you'll see now I have a stroke that forms its way around the line that we have. Perfect. Now we can go through and set some of these options. So I'll just scroll down the window here. You see the first option I have is brush size, which I can obviously drag left and right to increase or decrease the amount of stroke. What we might want to do when we're working in this kind of detail is let's just change the size of our composition window up to 100%, and let's also change the quality to full. And the other thing you might want to do, see the edges of this line are a little bit jagged. If you hit Command U or Control U on the PC, that will turn on the anti-aliasing for the solid layer in the timeline, which will just smooth out the edges so we're seeing everything in the full quality that we can. Another thing you'll notice, we just lost the Effect Controls window because we did click into the Comp window. Shortcut for that again is Shift-Command-T or Shift-Control-T on the PC, and that will bring that back to the foreground. You can always go up to the window menu and actually access that. It's down the bottom of the list, but shortcut-wise it's easy to bring up. So we have the brush size, that's easy enough. We can also affect the brush hardness, which allows us to make the line a lot more solid, or if we drag left it will feather that edge all the way down to 0. Now this does become more visible when you make the line a little bit thicker. You can see the soft edge there. I'm just going to hit Command-Z and just reset that option there, so we're back down to the original settings. We also have an opacity option here, so if you do wish to fade out the line or fade it over time to appear and disappear, that's very easy to do. And obviously all these properties here can be keyframed. Each one has a stopwatch down the left-hand side. Now a couple that are very important are these ones, start and end, and these are the items that allow us to animate the line across its entire length. So if I take the end point here, it's set to 100%, which means at the end of our line, the line is visible. If I drag that back, you'll see the line retracting itself all the way back to the beginning as I get down to 0%. So all we need to do is add a couple of keyframes to this end value to make it animate over time. That's very straightforward. Double check in your timeline that you are at 0 seconds along so you don't add a keyframe at the wrong place. And I'm just going to click a stopwatch for end. So that's now set a keyframe for 0% at 0 seconds along the timeline. What I'll then do is scroll all the way across the timeline, go to 6 seconds at the end, and then come back into this effects window and just drag that up to 100% all the way to the very end. Obviously, if you want to do it quicker than maybe dragging, you can just click on it just to highlight it and obviously key in the value that you want. So all these little shortcuts available. If I now just hit the space bar, I'm just going to basically play this. You can see the animation is now winding its way along the path. This is a great way to work on maps. As we know already, this filter does have its limitations. Like I said, we can't take position keyframe data from another layer. We can't create our own manual position keyframes. This option is working purely on masks. But that, obviously combined with Illustrator, does give us a very powerful function. Now, another thing you can animate in here is also the spacing, which is the number of dots on the line and the gaps between them. And as I drag out, we get our dynamic resolution preview here. When I let go, that will just re-render sharper. So you can now create dotted lines as well. And then the final thing you'd want to set in here is the paint style and how it's actually being used. So we could use it to reveal the original image. So this could be used as basically a matte or a track matte almost to reveal the layer beneath. At the moment we're saying on original image, which is the black solid, but let's say transparent, and we'll see through to the map underneath. Now you'll notice because we copied and pasted the path across from Illustrator, it doesn't contain exactly the same position values as we would expect from inside After Effects. So the path doesn't exactly match exactly what I was expecting to see. It doesn't follow the map perfectly. Well, that's easy enough to correct. I'm just going to hit Shift-Command-H again just to show the edges so we can see our mask. And then if I come down to the timeline, see solid 1 is highlighted, I'm just going to hit the M key just to show the mask. And I'm just going to click on it, which will highlight the whole thing. You can see it highlighted here in my window. I just use the hand tool to scroll over a second because what we need to do is just move this so it's in this location. Just hit the V key to take me back to my main cursor tool and then use my free transform option. Again, Command-T or Control-T on the PC. And all I need to do is then click on the area of the mask and drag that across pretty accurately. So the first dot here is in the center of this town. This one's over here and this one's over here. We can see all the points match. If I hit enter or return, that will say, fine, I'm happy with that. And again, we could just maybe hit 0 and do a RAM preview of that. And you'll see now that those dots do come out from exactly the right point. We'll just render that section right there. Okay, I'm just going to click to stop that preview and now just focus on another slight problem. Again, I'm just going to hit Shift-Command-H or Shift-Control-H just to hide the mask option so we can see the path. And keeping the same two keys held down, the Shift and Command or Shift Control, I'm going to hit T to bring back my effect controls, which I'll just pull down here into the screen. And what I'm going to do is just customize the line and bring it back towards a solid line. So I'm just going to drag this spacing value down here, pretty much down to about the average of around 15%, and check everything else is okay. Now there's one thing that happens when we use the stroke effect here on a mask, and that is that the timing stays consistent across the whole 6 seconds. Now you may not have noticed this. Let me just pull that window out of the way. But if we scroll through the timeline, we'll see that the line starts in the right place. We get to 1 second. The line is just shooting short of that. We can see that is the point at which it hits the center of that town. Let's keep going on. Get towards 2 seconds. That one looks pretty close to me. We get towards 3, and we're a long way off before we actually hit that town. Now, the reason for that is the motion of the start and the end point being from 0 to 100% is consistent across 6 seconds. but the towns aren't necessarily consistent with that speed as well, because there's more route here on the race map in that location than there may be in this location, and that's what's happening. Now this is really, really easy for us to update. It's just a matter of adding a couple of keyframes in to that endpoint. I'll show you what I mean. If we want to tidy up the coming into town 2, I'm going to take this point right here. So this is where we know the stroke actually drops into the right location. However, if we look on the timeline, the town actually comes into place at 1 second. So we're just a couple of frames over that. Well, the way to get around it is I'm going to select the layer I have, solid 1. I'm just going to hit the U key, which will show me any layers that have any keyframes applied. And you'll see here is our endpoint for the stroke itself. So this is where we are at the moment. This tells us that our stroke is 17.9% across, or that's what it should be to reach the center of this town. But we need to adjust that particular point in time and move it back. I'm going to come over here to the left column, and you'll see this is where we can navigate between keyframes that already exist, or if I click here, it will add another keyframe into the timeline of the exact value that we're at now. And that's all I want to do. But then what I can do is just come back to 1 second, which is where I know the town is going to appear, and just snap that keyframe into place. So what we've done is taken the point at which the path is in the right location and moved it to the right time. So now it matches perfectly. So let's scroll along a little bit more and do the same for town 3, because that's the one that really does stand out. So I'm just going to take this point right here, which is where the line is really out of place. So let's go right to there, which shows me the point at which we need to move that keyframe. Come back to the far left column and add another keyframe at that value, and you can see it appear here. And then all we need to do is come back to 3 seconds, which is where the dot appears, and snap that one in there, and you see the line shoots into position. So this is an easy way to just adjust the timing of that line. Even though it is consistent across the whole length of the animation, we can go in and customize that to our own needs. Now, another way to use masks is to use many different masks at the same time. So what I'm going to do is just come back down here. We can leave all these keyframes in place if we want to. I'm actually just going to highlight those 2 middle ones and hit delete. So we're getting rid of them. The motion's back as it was. I'm going to press Shift-Command-H just to bring back all the edges of the shapes that we have. And whilst I'm in the timeline, let me just hit the M key just to select the mask that's already in place there. Click on it to highlight it and hit delete, because what we're going to do is bring in some different masks that are of a completely different nature. Now those are actually stored in this file already. If you go to the bottom of your timeline, I'm just using the H key there to give me the hand so I can scroll up, and we can see that map 01 is right down here at the bottom. So hitting the V key just to go back to my cursor tool, I'm just going to unlock that layer and select it, and you'll see again that I have a mask on this layer, but it's actually more than one. If we hit M just to reveal the masks, you'll see that there are actually 5 in here. Let me just collapse these up. Obviously, the shortcut of M is giving me the mask shape option. You'll see here I have 5 individual masks, 1 for each stage. So we can see that's from point 0 to point 1. That goes from 1 to 2, that goes 2 to 3, and so forth. What I'm going to do is select all 5 of those just by shift-clicking on the mask itself in the timeline, and that obviously selects all the points. And again, I'm just going to copy those, Command-C or Control-C, and then move back up the timeline right the way to the very top, select the layer that we started with, our solid layer, and hit Command-V to paste. Now, because we've copied the masks from within After Effects to within After Effects, it copies and pastes them into exactly the right position, so we don't have to reposition like we did with the one from Illustrator a short while ago. If we now look back at the Effect Controls window, scroll back up to the top of it, you can see that from the path options, I do have an option to choose each one of the individual masks, which will work fine. But I can come in here and say, let's use all masks and choose to stroke them sequentially. Just going to turn that one off for a second so you can see exactly what this means. And I'm going to press again, Shift-Command-H, hide all my edges. And I'm just going to scroll through the timeline. You can see what's going on. Because I'm not stroking sequentially, each one of these lines is drawing itself from 0 to 100%. Don't forget, we still have our keyframe applied for the end point of this layer. And the lines are actually drawing individually. Now, this is a pretty interesting way to draw many different effects. Things like bacteria, you can actually draw things like kind of creating themselves and wiggling on screen from individual mask points, because every single one of these masks will be stroked at the same time. What I can do in this instance is go back to the effect controls and say stroke sequentially, and that allows me to run them all in one time. So this is basically to show you that you don't have to have the mask as all one option. You can actually construct them as separate ones if it's easier for you to edit, but the same options apply, start and finish, and everything else can be animated. Now, a couple of things I want to point out before we go on to the next filter is the fact that brush size and brush hardness and opacity here can be keyframed, but they can only be keyframed globally. What that means is if I was scrolled all the way back to the beginning of my timeline, and I come back and say, give me a keyframe for brush size, but I'm actually going to start it down around maybe just 2. And then if I scroll to maybe 2 seconds along to when we almost reach the second town here, and I increase it, you see that the whole line increases. I'm not able to actually say, well, let's start this at 2, and as the line works its way along, it gradually gets thicker and thicker until it's thicker at this point, but still thin at the end. For that, we're going to use another filter called write on, which allows us to write information onto a stroke that's been created many different ways. The thing about write on is it does allow us to write text on, but it doesn't allow us to write it off again. Now, that's one thing that stroke does allow us to do. Let me just confirm that with you. If I just come up here and change the brush hardness up towards 100% and just bring the brush size down a little bit, there we go. You see that we animated the endpoint here to go from 0 to 100%, and it works its way along the line. The cool thing about this is you can also animate the start point to follow it. So we can actually draw the path going in one direction and then have it follow itself out. And again, this is pretty cool when you combine it with the sequentially option. We turn that off, so each of the lines can draw itself on, but at the same time, we can also draw itself off. So you can get some really cool effects here. Okay, let's go ahead and close that effects window down, and let's also close this whole composition down because we're going to go to the next option, which is write on. And you see this is the second composition here in the project window, so let's just double click to open it. And you'll see it's again another version of the map that we had a second ago. And this one's just got a different mask for us to use, but pretty much the whole animation is the same. We go through the timeline and the dots appear at 1 second apart. There's 2 seconds for the end one because of its longer duration of that particular stage. And we're going to apply the write on filter. So I'm just going to hit Command Y here. It's our new shortcut, or Control Y for doing a solid, making sure it's the full size of the composition. Color-wise, that doesn't matter because we can replace that afterwards and also make it transparent. So let's drop that over the top there. And also hit Command U or Control U to turn on the anti-aliasing for that layer. You will see the icon change in your switches view down in the timeline when you do that. So let's go and choose the actual effect for this. I'm going to go to my Effect menu and go down to Stylize, and then choose the very last option down here, which is Write On. Okay, now that will appear. Let's go to our comp window, move the Effects Controls palette over here into position. Let's drag that up. Now, if I press Shift Command H at this point just to hide those edges, you'll see that at the moment we don't particularly have anything appearing in here because we haven't really specified any position or animation at this point. So if we scroll through here, there's absolutely nothing going on. So what we could do is animate the overall brush position to give us different locations. Now, if we wanted to follow the rough course of the map underneath, we need to be able to see that map so we can apply these keyframe changes. So let's go down to the timeline, select switches and modes down here so we can see our layer blending modes. And because the layer is black, the quickest way to get rid of all the pixels in that layer and see only the lighter ones, which could be our stroke when we draw on it, is to turn on screen. And that will reveal everything underneath it. All we need to do now is to adjust the position of brush position and apply some simple keyframes. So again, press Shift Command H just to bring all the controls back because this allows us to see the brush position, which is here in the center. But we can also choose the crosshair tool here inside the Effect Controls window and just drop that over into the very, very center of our start point. Again, if we want to work at a higher magnification, by all means, let's go to 100% here in the comp window, turn on full quality, and then just use the hand tool to scroll across to wherever we need to be. Let's go about there. And again, Shift Command T or Shift Control T to bring back those effect controls when they get moved like that. And of course, the V key just to give us our cursor tool back. So a bunch of shortcuts we're using here. What I'm going to do now is apply a keyframe to brush position. So let's turn on the stopwatch here for that. And then down on my timeline, let's scroll across to 1 second to the point where that second town appears. And then all we need to do is pick up brush position again and specify the second location. And you'll see now my line is drawn between those 2 points. So continue going through the timeline here just for a couple of options. We don't need to do the whole thing because we are going to change this. But instead of actually going to the crosshair each time, go down and choose the actual graphic here which says this is brush position on the main composition window and drag it. And you'll see as I drag it, I'm having control of the location and style of this line. Let's pull it down into this position right here. Scroll the timeline across maybe just another second to that other town. And let's pull this one up into position also. Now what we're doing is because we're manually animating this over time, we don't have to specify a start and end point keyframe because the effect is doing it for us. You see as we drag through the timeline, the line is being drawn at exactly the points we want it to be. So in this respect, it's actually a little easier to do than the stroke filter. But you'll see that we only have a path that's very smooth, it's very straightforward with slight Bezier curves. If we wanted to adjust this, we'd have to go to different points along the line and add more keyframes in and pull them around. So it's possible to do, but it's a little bit slower. Now if I bring the Effect Controls window back, Shift Command T or Shift Control T, this will allow us now to create some extra options. You'll see here everything is controlled by brush position, not a mask. So how would we utilize a mask for this particular effect? Well, it's possible to convert a mask into keyframe data for brush position. That's exactly what we're going to do. So let's turn this one off. Okay, so I've turned off all the keyframes here, so we're back to just the original position, which is currently in the start town. What I'm going to do is go down to the timeline, again using the H key just to give me my hand tool so I can scroll up, and you'll see down the bottom here is map 1 PSD. If I hit the V key to get my cursor tool and unlock the layer and select it, you'll see that there is a mask revealing here inside the comp window, and this is the one I want to use. Now, alternatively, I could obviously go across into Illustrator and copy and paste a path over as well, or even Photoshop. Any vector path that's been drawn either in After Effects as a mask or in Illustrator and Photoshop can be copied and pasted as well. All I'm going to do is copy the one we have. So with that one selected, just hit the M key to show me the mask shape, click on it to select it, and then hit Command C just to copy that. Get the H key back and scroll all the way to the top of this layer again. If I hit the V key to get my cursor tool, select the solid that we're going to apply our effect to, but I'm not going to paste it. Remember, we can't use a mask as the position. We need to convert that. Well, the way to do it, let's pull the Effect Controls window down here so you can see everything that happens at the same time. I want to basically paste the mask information into this value, brush position. Okay, so here's a real quick and easy way to do it. I can't literally select that and just paste directly. I have to use a couple of shortcuts, which are quite handy. First thing I'll do is turn on a keyframe for brush position. Now, the reason I do this is if I come down to the timeline here and hit the U key, it will reveal any effect or any transformation that's taken place with a keyframe. If I didn't add a keyframe to brush position, I'd have to twirl down every single option here until I found effect. I'd see the effect and I'd see all of its options and have to go down and locate where brush position is to be able to perform this shortcut. This is just one of those quick and easy ways to locate it because the U key will show you any keyframes. We're not going to use that keyframe, but just creating it is a great way to get to and from a certain point in the line. Now, if I turn that keyframe off here in the timeline, but you see brush position is still highlighted, if I now hit Command V and paste, the mask is now pasted in over here on the right-hand side as positional keyframe data. So we've actually converted a mask from a mask shape into position shape. So we now have the animation that we need. And if I quickly scroll through here, you'll see the line is drawing itself in the composition window, albeit over 2 seconds. You'll see the keyframes here come in as a default of 2 seconds long. And we want to adjust this to fit 6. And these keyframes are really easy. These are called roving keyframes. Because we pasted in the mask data, all these keyframes will actually stretch and condense connected to each other. To see what I mean, just take the last keyframe and drag it, and you'll see that the keyframes are retaining their proportional values. So they're staying perfectly connected to each other, not being unevenly distributed over time. So let's just come all the way to the end. I'm using the Shift key there. As I get towards the end, if I hold down Shift, the keyframe will snap to the end of the animation. Okay, and now we have our full line. If we just continue scrolling through there, see the animation has been taken care of. Now, this is a really easy way to create a path for write-on. Just simply copy and paste a path from another vector creation program or a mask inside of After Effects and utilize that information. So let's come back to probably about 1.5 seconds, because what we're going to do is customize this line a little bit now. Come back to the composition window now. Let's pull our effects controls up here and take a look at some of the ways that we can increase the quality and effect on the line. The first option we have here is obviously color. Now, very similar to what the options are for stroke. If we click on here and pick ourselves a new color, such as maybe yellow, and say OK, then obviously the line will change to yellow, and that is a global change. However, it is possible to animate that color in a completely different way. I'm actually going to combine this with another couple of animations, so we'll get to that in just a second. We also have brush size, which is obviously very important for the thickness of the line that you wish to animate, so dragging it will increase or decrease, so that's fairly straightforward. And again, just like in stroke, the hardness value of the brush has basically full anti-aliasing with no soft edge, all the way down to a completely soft edge when you're on 0. But again, you won't notice that unless the stroke is much thicker like this. I'm actually keeping this fairly thin for now, and we'll take the hardness value to roundabout as default, which bizarrely enough is around 79%. It's just one of those settings that we keep as it is for now. Now, the other thing to look at is the brush opacity. Again, the same as stroke, which allows overall fade in and out, which is not the same as adjusting the opacity of the layer that it's on. Don't forget that will affect it also. And if we come down to the other options here, we also have brush spacing, which will obviously apply these effects as dots rather than a single stroke. And again, I'm just going to keep this down to pretty much the basics at this point. But as we approach the bottom of the write-on filter, you can see we have some interesting extra options. I'll just pull this window out a bit, we can see what that says. So we have an option that says paint time properties. Now what this means is that we can adjust the properties of the paint over time so that instead of changing globally, they change based on keyframes. The options under here, we have either color or opacity, which means if we apply opacity or color keyframes along the line at certain points and specify this as color, the actual color values will show up as varying colors on the line. So we can start the line white, change its color about here, change it back about here to another different color, and see this change all the way along, rather than the whole line changing color, which was the same as our stroke effect. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come back to the very start on my timeline, scroll back to the beginning. I'm going to leave my paint time properties set to color, because this is the effect that I want, and I'm just going to scroll up to where the color option is, and I'm going to reset this color to white. Now the reason I'm using base colors here is I want to actually highlight where the hillier parts of this ride are. Obviously we're doing a ride here that's through the Pyrenees and the Alps and over into Italy. I want to show where the roads get higher and they get lower, and I'm going to color code that. So first let's turn on a keyframe for color at 0 seconds, and I'm going to scroll through to where I think we'll start to hit the mountains, which is probably about here. And then if I come down to the timeline, I've got solid 1 still highlighted. I'm going to hit the U key, which will actually close up all of the options that I have available right now. But if I hit it again, it will now reveal any other layers that have keyframes applied, and you can see here, color is one of them. So here's our keyframe for white. What I'm going to do is actually just copy and paste that keyframe, which keeps it white from basically that point to that point. But then if I just move the timeline along a little bit so we start to get into the mountains, I'm now going to get my effect controls window back and choose a new color, because I want to use maybe red to highlight where the mountains get a little bit higher. So maybe not go quite so strong, just more of an orange, and say OK. And you'll see that this has now applied an orange tint to just that point. So there is now a fade between these two keyframes on my timeline. And what we can do is simply keep on going in the same direction. So as I scroll through, we kind of head back down to white at that point. And rather than keep chopping and changing between using the color palette here, we can obviously come back and just copy and paste the keyframes. So we know that keyframe 2 is white, keyframe 3 is orange. As long as we remember that, we can copy and paste them in the right order. So let's select keyframe 2, just copy it and paste it. And because my time cursor is right here where I want it to be, that is where the keyframe gets pasted down. So let's continue scrolling. Let's say we're going to hit the edge of the mountains again right there. So let's paste in again another white keyframe, and then scroll along a little bit more until we hit the top of this mountain, maybe on that curve. And let's go back and select keyframe 3, which is our orange one, copy that and paste that. So you can see that we have control here over the amount of color that's contained inside these areas. This is really, really cool because you can use it to highlight parts of a stroke, which is not very easy to do using any other option. You could achieve this maybe using masks, but your underlying image would have to contain all these color areas in exactly the right location. It would be quite difficult to do. This way, it's really straightforward. Now, as well as doing the actual color values of the stroke, we can also animate the brush size the same way without doing it globally. So I want the roads to be a little thinner where they're actually flat and then get thicker as they get towards the top of the mountains. So again, let's go right back to the start. Let's apply a keyframe here for brush size. Drop that value down to actually about probably 2.5, just keeps it fairly thin. And again, down in the timeline with solid 1 selected, hit the U key to close it up and hit it again to reveal all keyframe properties, and now brush size is shown in there. And let's work our way along. So the point that we add these keyframes doesn't have to match the ones that we've already applied underneath. It's our choice. So I might just come back a little bit more here, copy and paste the keyframe we already have selected, which keeps that value consistent. And then as we move up here into the mountains to maybe this point, I'll just drag this value up a little bit until we see it thicker. Now you'll notice as I'm doing that, it's thickening up the whole line. And the only reason for that is in the effect controls window, we must scroll down to the bottom here and choose our brush time properties. And instead of saying none, let's actually select the size of the stroke. And what that means is the stroke will now increase and decrease based on the keyframes that we apply along the duration of the line, not just the whole thing. Let's just add a couple more in there so we can check that out. So as we approach this part back down here into the valley, again, we have keyframes 2 and 3 are the ones that contain our changes. So let's select keyframe 2, copy it and paste it. You see the line is now getting thinner. Let's keep it thin until we hit the very edge here. Paste it again because it keeps it consistent. And then as soon as we come up here and get into the mountains, let's select keyframe 3, which is where the stroke gets thicker, and copy and paste that. And you see the line is now getting thicker as well. So we have control over these elements, and you see it allows you to create some really individual strokes. And like I say, there's not really any other way to get this type of effect without some very intricate masking work and various options like that. Now, another thing to bear in mind with the write-on filter, and especially the way we're working, at the moment we've got paint style set to on original image. Okay, you can see it right here. I actually want it on a transparent background because I want to add a filter to this. So as soon as I hit that on transparent, we can see that I still have this kind of funky transparency through the middle of my line here. Well, that's because our layer blending mode down here is still set to screen. Don't forget, we use that for just our initial transparency to make it easier to plot some points. Let's go back and reset that to normal, and now we have the stroke at its full strength. Now, if I go back to the effect menu and go all the way down to perspective, you'll see that I have one down here called drop shadow, and we'll use this a couple of times today as well. So let's drop that into our effect controls window. And you see that the way that all the effects stack up in here, it does get kind of clustered. So let's just drop that option down so we can see it a little bit easier. There we go. And we can see that now we have a drop shadow underneath our line. So I'm just going to customize those settings a shade more. Let's drag the distance out a little bit, so further away from that edge. Maybe just drag the softness up to give that a bit of a feathered edge. And once you feather it, you do tend to lose a little bit of the contrast. So I'll just drag up the opacity to maybe towards 60 or 70%, somewhere between the two of those. Okay, if I now just hit 0 and do a preview, you'll notice that because we've added the drop shadow filter after the right on filter, you can see the drop shadow is being drawn as we go through the route. So it's just one of those little things you can add to it to kind of lift that path off the map. Another thing you obviously have to bear in mind is that the effect we're applying here is to a solid that's on top of everything. If we want this line to appear underneath the dots, we just need to change its layer stacking order in the timeline and move it down so it's below the layers that these dots are stored on. Okay, let's just preview that to there. So you can see the stroke drawing with a drop shadow underneath it. The line thickness is changing. We can even affect the opacity the same way as well. So as the line continues along, it does get a little bit thinner and a little bit more faded out. So why don't I show you that very, very briefly. Let me just click. And I'm going to set my preview window back down to 50% and half quality. And I'm going to scroll all the way back to the beginning of the timeline and just hit Command Y just to provide another new solid to this layer. And I'm just going to make this one small just for this instance because we're going to use a final option for animating the position properties of the right on effect. Let me show you this one. This is really cool. Let's hit OK. So here's our solid in the center. And what I'm going to do is go up to my window menu and choose this little option here, which is called Motion Sketch. Now this brings up the Motion Sketch palette. And basically what it does is it captures the motion that you apply on screen in real time. So it's a great way to animate something moving at exactly the right speed and direction and style that you want it to because you literally draw it yourself. Now you can see that the way the palette works is it has a start capture button over here. And as soon as I hit that, it's kind of charged up and ready to start recording. What I can do is decide what I want to do with this object. And as soon as I click and start dragging it, it will record that information. And don't forget, we have about 6 seconds on this animation of recording time. As soon as you reach the end of the timeline, it will stop the recording for you so you know when you've reached the actual endpoint. That doesn't mean, though, that you have to go all the way to that endpoint. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Cintiq screen, which is one of those screens that allows me to use a Wacom pen directly on the screen, which is what I've got right here. So I'm able to pick this object up and actually draw across the screen using the pen tool. It's a little bit more easier than using a mouse. Also, if you have an Intuos tablet, it will work the same way. Just a pen is much handier than using a mouse sometimes. So what I'm going to do is come up and hit Start Capture. Now it's waiting for me, ready to do what I want. You see here in my info palette that's come up, it says click to begin capture. I have to click anywhere. It doesn't matter. I don't have to select this object. Just going to click here and just do a simple stroke like that. Okay, just straightforward, up and down. And if I just scroll through the timeline here, you can see that object is now moving based on those keyframes. And if we go down and look in the timeline for this layer, this solid layer, and hit U to show us the keyframes, you can see there's all the position keyframe data that I just had for that solid. So this is really cool. What I can do now is click on the word position, and that will highlight all of these position keyframes, which I can now copy and paste into here to replace the brush position ones that we already have for our filter. So let's just do that. I'm going to hit copy, Command C, turn that layer off because we don't need to see it, come back down to our solid one here. I'm going to turn off the keyframes for brush position, so we lose everything we've done. But with brush position still highlighted, I can press Command V and paste in exactly the same keyframes that we have here. So if we come back up to the comp window, let's just hide our motion sketch option there. Let's just scroll through this so we can see that the line that's being drawn is following exactly that same path. So we've just copied and pasted motion sketch keyframe data, which looks really cool. Okay, and what I'm going to do is go all the way back to the beginning of that. And I'm just going to bring up the effect controls, Shift Command T. Let's hide the drop shadow, bring down the right on options. And I'm going to turn off the items that I don't wish to animate at this point, which is going to be color and brush size. So we're reverting back to where we were. Let's just scroll through this so we can see our finished stroke. Come out to there. And then all I'm going to do is affect the brush size. Let's just thicken that up. Now what I want to do is to animate the brush size so it actually gets thinner and slightly more transparent towards the end, so it's more like a stroke. So I'm just showing you a couple of the final features here for Write On. We are going to use it again in just a short while. So let's go right back to the very beginning of the timeline, apply a keyframe here for brush size and also brush hardness, and we'll set that up to 100% so it's as hard an edge as it can be. And then if I scroll out to probably about 120 or up to 2 seconds, it depends on how long you made your animation, but you'll see if I scroll here on screen, you can actually see how long that is. So round about the end point there, I'm going to take the brush size down, and you'll see as I'm doing that, because we still have our preferences set down here to brush time is affecting size, that's now giving us a fade out of the size of the brush. We can also do the same with hardness. Let's actually thin this out. Let's make it more feathered. Okay, and you'll see that the brush is also feathering as it reaches that end point. So again, just hit the 0 key, do a round preview of that. You can see a stroke, it still has our drop shadow applied, it's still got its white thickness, but the line you're able to control over a distance to make it thinner. So it's great for doing things like signing or showing an illustration of something being drawn and constructed. And that's pretty much everything we need to do for Write On. Okay, one more cool thing I want to show you just before we get on to the next filter is actually using a transform filter to follow the map around. And this is really cool once you see it. I'm just going to show you kind of as a little extra here we can play with. So I'm actually going to press Command Z and back up through many of the options that we've just done. So I'm going to go back way before we did our motion sketch. Let's just keep going back. Obviously, the right thing to do would be to have saved the project before we got to this point, then we could have reverted. But I can see here that here is my stroke. I've gone back to where the original part of the map is. And you'll see the stroke is still there and it's playing all the way to the end. The reason I want this path in here is I'm going to use this position data to allow us to zoom up on this map and stay focused on the actual position point of the stroke and use that as an actual focal point. So the map itself will move, yet our camera will stay focused on the central point. It's a really cool little effect and very easy to do using an adjustment layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close down our external palette, our effect controls, come down to the beginning of our timeline, and most importantly, select the brush position property down here, which highlights all my position keyframes, and copy those into the memory. Those are the most important ones that we're going to use here. Now, if I collapse this up, I'm going to go up to my layer menu, go down to new, and instead of doing a solid layer this time, we're actually going to use an adjustment layer. Now, if I select that, we get a brand new layer on the screen, but we're not actually seeing anything yet. The adjustment layer doesn't actually contain any content. What it allows us to do is to make simple things like color changes or adjustments to the actual tones and quality of the image, but it's applied to all the layers below which this layer sits, exactly the same as Photoshop to anyone who uses that program. The cool thing about this, though, is we can also apply any of the other effects, such as blur or any of the distortion effects, which will also affect all the ones below. Now, we'll go into that into more detail later. I'm just going to go through and apply one of those effects very quickly here. Go to the Effect menu, and I'm going to go all the way down to Distort and choose a very simple one called Transform. Now it's going to allow us to pretend that the layer has been transformed. So here's the effect window. It actually says here's your transform options, so we can affect the anchor point, the position. See, if I just drag off position here, see all my layers underneath are moving in one go. They're not physically being moved. The adjustment layer is tricking them into believe they're being moved. So likewise, if I just press Command Z, reset those changes, the scale option, this is the funky one. If I drag up on this, we're able to scale on all the layers as if we were actually magnifying on them. Now, the thing to bear in mind here is if you are going to do this, you need high resolution images. Okay, we're only working on video quality images here that I haven't prepared for scaling, but this effect is just to point it out for you. So do make sure you have images that can be scaled up. So basically bring them in much larger, drop them into your composition much smaller, and then the scaling, you won't notice any degradation of the image quality. Now, the item that we're going to animate is the anchor point. At the moment, the anchor point is the central point here, and if we tell this anchor point to follow the path that we have for our map, the path central will stay here, and this map will completely move itself around to show us the effect. So we'll always stay focused on the center here. Let's give this a try. All we need to do, again, for our shortcut options is apply a keyframe to anchor point right here, and come down to our timeline. Adjustment layer 1 is selected, and I'm going to hit the U key to show me, again, those properties that have keyframes. Like we did before, let's just turn off the anchor point keyframe we have, and then press Command V or Control V to paste the anchor point position properties in from the original property we copied, which was obviously the path itself. If we now come back to the comp window, let's just pull our effects control palette out of the way and just hit 0 for a round preview, you'll see exactly what we've got. We've now got the map staying focused on the central point, but it's following and moving itself around based on the position properties of the path. The anchor point is doing all this control for us. And don't forget, this is all through an adjustment layer. The layers underneath are still intact and are not being damaged or moved around in any way. So let me just click there and we can see it in action. Beautiful, looks really, really cool. At any time, you can obviously go in and adjust the zoom or even the rotation if you wanted to. But this is just one of those things I wanted to point out as we go along, and it's great when you're working with maps. You can produce some wonderful effects this way. Okay, let me come back to my effects window here and just close it down. What we're going to do now is go on to one of the final stroke filters for effects, which is called Vegas, and this addresses some of the property drawbacks that we've had with a couple of the other filters we've used already. Okay, let's close this composition down. You can always save it to check it over again later. And let's open up Comp 3, which is number 3 here. It says Vegas and Paint. So double click to open that. And again, it's another version of our map, and this one has a solid layer which has a mask already applied. If I just come down to the timeline and select Vegas Outline, you can see that the mask there is highlighted. So what I'm going to do here is apply one of our other effects. Let's go back to the Effect menu, go all the way down to Render, and choose the very last option, which is Vegas. Okay, now that's been added. Let's come back up to the comp window. Let's drag this up top left. It's a nice small window at the moment. And it's set to say stroke the image contours. Now that's basically saying find the outer dimensions of the layer, which could be pixels, and animate around those. Well, I can show you that one in a second. I'm actually going to go for the next option down, which is mask or path. And obviously we have a mask on here, so I'm choosing to stroke that option. Now again, I'm going to press Shift Command H to hide the edges of the mask in the background so you can see it. And you'll see now we have a gently dotted line going around the outside here. Now the reason I'm using this filter is instead of on the previous maps where I had a course that went from point A to B to C to D, I actually want to run this one in an anti-clockwise direction so we can see the overall route of maybe the whole course. And this is a filter that makes that really, really easy. Now what I need to do is to check that the mask itself is completely transparent or not visible. So what I'm going to do is come down to the timeline, hit M to show me the mask for that layer, and at the moment it says Add. So I'm actually going to say None. Okay, so we can just see the whole thing as it is at this point, so we're not hiding out those edges. And if we come back to the comp window, I can actually come scrolling down here and choose the rendering option. And here it says the blend mode at the moment is saying rendering it over the layer I have. This is pretty cool. You can also say render it under, so the gray central area of the mask can stay, and the Vegas stroke, only half of it will be visible because it's poking out from behind the layer itself. So that's one pretty cool way to add an effect behind your lettering or something. You can also stencil it, so it's used as like a mask on the layer itself, so you'll only see the layer's original contents through the strokes of Vegas. What we're going to do is obviously choose transparent, so we can now see through it to the map beneath. Now obviously we could affect the color of this stroke. At the moment it's set to yellow, so I can either click on here or even use the eyedropper tool and just pick up one of these colors here, so I've changed that to a gray. I can also come in here and choose the width of the line, so let's thicken that up just a little bit. I don't want to do too much at this point. Let's go for around 6. And then we have a whole bunch of other options down here, and just to see these, let's drag our window out so we can see what each one is. So the first option I have here is the hardness of the line. At the moment it's set to 0, which means that the line is very fuzzy around all its edges. It's very anti-aliased and smooth. If I drag out here, you can see that my line is gently getting harder as we go through this. If you go all the way up to 100, it does actually get a little bit clunky, so do make sure the line is thick enough to cope with the hardness value that you apply to it. So I'm going to bring that down to around about 0.27, that kind of area. We also have here what's called the start opacity. Now this means how strong each of the segments is at its front end right here. So this is kind of the direction that they're flowing in, so the front end here is the strongest end. If we drag that start opacity down, you'll see that the front end of the line is gently fading to match towards the back end. So this gives you a pretty fine control over the type of effect you want to see. I'm going to leave that up around 1. If we look down at the next options, we have a couple of things that are very similar, the midpoint opacity and the midpoint position. And this is very much based on the gradient features of Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop, where we can affect the midpoint, which is around about halfway through the blend where the color starts to fade towards the back. So our midpoint opacity at the moment is 0. What I can do is increase that. So at the midpoint, it's still round about 50%, and then it tails off just in that last section. So that's what's giving you control over that. You can drag in either direction, set that round to about 0. You can also affect the midpoint position. At the moment, it is set to halfway through the line at 0.5 or say 50%. If I drag to the right there, you'll see that the midpoint is moving towards the back of the line, just changes its color slightly. But again, it's just one of those controls that's very fine, and depending on the thickness of the line you have, you'll see more and more options as you go through it. I just drop down again. The last option we have here is end opacity, which as I click and drag is affecting the transparency of the very end of the stroke. And if I come all the way up to 1, we basically end up with the same as if we'd used the stroke filter or the write-on filter. We have a solid line. So this is allowing us to crank back, and if we want to, just shorten that back to where it was. Let's come back up here. So we've gone through, those are the rendering options that I have. So let's close that up. Now what we're going to do is control the segments options. So let's drop this down. The first option I have here is the number of segments that are being shown around the outside of the path. So if we click to increase that, you see we'll end up with more strokes, and obviously the further you go, you're going to get more of a dotted line, but it still is pretty cool because it contains all those fade and transparency options that we've seen already. Again, something that we can't do with stroke or with write-on. And if we pull back the other way, obviously the further we go to the left, the fewer strokes we have. It looks almost a little bit more electric as well. So this is a great way to do kind of a neon electric feel around lettering or graphics just by reducing the number of segments. So let me just increase that a shade more, roughly back to where we were. Here, obviously, the length of the segments, you can shorten them down. So they're almost like a fly pattern that's moving around the outside of a shape. So if you shorten that length down, again, that length is taking into account the opacity of the segment, the midpoint opacity and the midpoint position, all those things that we saw in the rendering section. So make sure you're playing with those options as well as you set these preferences here. We can also adjust the segment distribution so it's even or bunched up around the corners. And again, just try these options out and see the effect that you want to achieve. The animation, though, comes here from the rotation option. Now you see if I click and drag on here and drag to the right, these lines are all moving around in a clockwise direction. And this is how easy it is to animate them. What we want them to do is to go in the opposite direction, so I'm just going to add a couple of keyframes to this. Let me just reset that back to 0. And in our timeline, we are right at the very beginning of the timeline, so I'm just going to add a keyframe here for rotation. And then if you drop down to your timeline, just scroll all the way through to the end, that's 6 seconds along. We can then come to rotation. I'm only going to apply a very small amount, but make sure it's in the minus direction, so it's going anti-clockwise. And maybe just about 15 degrees. A lot of people think, oh, let's put 360 in there because I want it to go around, complete circle. Depending on the number of segments you have, that does make an extremely high speed animation. So start out with something slow. Just hit the 0 key to do a RAM preview. And let's just RAM preview just a couple of seconds of this. And then I'll click and you'll see the motion. That is 15. Imagine how fast 360 is. So this is going in a fairly even direction. Okay, let's just bring everything back. I can always go back in there and say, well, let's make that actually a little bit more. Let's go minus 30. Again, hit 0 for a RAM preview. We now have a little bit more speed on there and more control. So the Vegas filter is really cool for this kind of option. It gives you a way of showing an overall direction around something. It's giving you control over the number of segments and the types of things you can do, and gives a really good effect. And like I said, if you add it around the outsides of lettering or around some keyed QuickTime footage that you have of a silhouette walking on a background, you can utilize it for some really good functions. So what I'm going to do is just apply the same filter again, but onto this TV logo in the top left corner here, just so you can see the outlines option that we have here. If I just come back up to the top of this window, you see at the moment we are following mask path. I pointed out we have image contours. I'm quickly going to show you how we can use that. So I'll close this one down because we're obviously going to apply it to another layer. And what I'm going to do is just set my window size to 100%. Let's go full quality, and then just use my hand tool and scroll up to the top left here. If we then go back down to the timeline, hit the V key to get my cursor tool, and you see my logo 3D layer here is the one that I'm going to use. I'm just going to unlock it and select it so we can use it. Go back up to the comp window, go to my effects again, and instead of going all the way down to the render menu and choosing the one I want, Vegas was the last one I used, so it's available here right at the very top. So I can just apply that now to this layer. And you'll see in the effect controls window that obviously we have a drop shadow applied to this layer already. I want to make sure that the Vegas stroke is being applied before drop shadow, otherwise it's working the other way around. The layer is being rendered with its drop shadow, and then Vegas will be applied on top of that. So do make sure that you adjust your render pipeline accordingly. So let's put the drop shadow down below Vegas. Now we can go into the Vegas controls and specify exactly what we want. So let me just expand the window out here a second. So we are going to use image contours this time. We're not using a mask or a path, so we're going to locate basically the alpha channel information for this layer. It has its own alpha channel, so that's working just fine. If we go to image contours here, the most important thing is to choose which layer do we want to control the input for this filter. Well, 9 times out of 10, you're obviously going to choose the layer you're currently working on. So we are going to go down here and choose Logo 3D. That's the layer we currently have. And then this is pretty important here, the threshold value. That chooses how many levels of color it's going to use in order to apply the Vegas stroke. Now 127 is exceptionally high. I actually want to go pretty much down to basic. So I'm just going to highlight that and key in about 1.5. And as I do, you see I now have a series of dots around the outside of our TV logo. And if I just scroll through the timeline, you'll see that that is being applied to all sides of that logo based on its image contours. So I'm just going to go in and quickly edit a few of these functions to make some changes. So let's close this option back up here. Image contours is pretty much done. We want to look at segments. I only want a specific number of segments. I'm actually going to drop that down really low to about 3. I want it very, very simple. And the length and everything is very much as I need it to be. If we want to animate the rotation values, we obviously can. I'm going to leave it just as it is for now. What I do want to do is go down to rendering and change the color of the stroke. So I'm just going to click here and make that into a black so it's got a hard edge to it. See, now we've got a really kind of arty, funky edge being applied around the outside of the logo, but in kind of very sporadic areas, which is very nice. I like this kind of fluid style that we've got here. I also want to gently increase the width and maybe about 3 or 4, not too much. Maybe I'll go somewhere in between, about 3.5. Just thickens that edge up quite nicely. But then I also want to affect the hardness. At the moment it's down to 0, so it's very blurred out and very fuzzy. I'm actually going to crank that up to its hardest option, which is 1. And that gives us this kind of very closed up and clunky edge around the outside of the object. If I just hit 0 to preview that now, you can see that's being applied really coolly around the outside of the logo. This is a good way to actually make footage basically dirty. Actually takes away the quality that it has, roughens it up, and also adds a really kind of nice stroke around the edge, which you still can animate the same way we have here with these Vegas strokes, but it's using it for a completely different function on a layer that's already been rendered and has alpha channel transparency. So that highlights most of the options for Vegas. It gives us some good tools to play with and hopefully gives you some ideas. What we're going to do is take a quick look at the last option here, which is vector paint, which is one of the newer filters that After Effects has. So let's come back to 50%, half quality just for now, and bring our timeline back to the very start. And then what I want to do is just hide the layers that we've been working on. So let's hide the Vegas outline, okay? And what we're going to do is hand sketch an outline around this particular area using the paint filter. So again, let's go all the way back to the layer menu and either choose new, solid, or our fantastic shortcut, Command Y, Control Y. Make sure it's comp size. The last one we did was actually reduced down in size, so make sure that's a preset. Say OK, and then all we'll simply do is go to the Effect menu, go down to Paint, and choose the only option here, which is Vector Paint. Let's highlight that, move it over here into position, and very importantly, we need to make sure our selection edges are visible here. Don't forget we've had them hidden, so we're not seeing our masks, so press Shift-Command-H, Shift-Control-H, just to show them all. You'll notice that on the left side of the comp window there, we have a bunch of tools that have just appeared. If I do Shift-Command-H to hide again, that's actually removed. That's because these tools are actually part of the effect itself. If we hide the effect edges, we also lose the tools. So I'll just pull my window over there slightly so you can see that. Bring the effect controls back in here. Now what we're going to do is do kind of a real-time record of a few paint strokes in this layer working around the actual map in the background. Again, to do this, we need to be able to see through this layer so we can add some effects to it. So I'm going to go back down to the timeline. My solid is highlighted. I'm just going to hit T to give me the opacity controls and just drag the opacity back so I can see some of the map through the background, just to give me an idea of where I'm actually working. If I come back up to the composition window now, I can then start to customize the tool to work the way I want to. Now I can use all the settings in here if I want to. We're just going to use this in its most basic form, pretty much all of which I can do without using this palette in the main window. So I'm going to pull this out of the way so we have our main window here that we can draw in. And again, I'm going to be using the Cintiq screen from Wacom because I'm going to be able to draw manually on the screen here using my paintbrush. First thing I do want to check is when I come up to this pop-up menu on the left-hand side, come down to Shift Paint Records and choose In Real Time. We're going to do a continuous one later. I'll show you that separately, but let's go for In Real Time right now. So that means that if I hold down the Shift key when I draw, it's going to record everything I do in real-time motion. And that's obviously based on the length of your timeline as well, don't forget. If we come back to the comp window, the last thing I want to do is adjust the thickness of my stroke. Now, like I said, we can do pretty much all of this without using the palette, and it's very easy. If I hold down the Apple key or the Control key on the PC and click and drag on screen, you see I'm able to adjust the size of the brush. If I let go at this point and hold down the Option key or the Alt key and drag back, this will actually adjust the feathering of the brush. Okay, so there's two little options there that you can play with. I'm not going to affect either of those. I'm just going to go back to size itself. Let's leave that as it is, maybe go a little bit smaller. But just so you know that the feathering option's there if you want to paint with a gently feathered edge. And obviously that edge can be adjusted afterwards, so don't worry. What I'm going to do now is very quickly sketch a rough area around the outside. Let's say this is just an illustration someone's doing to say, well, this is the rough route I think that the race should take. So all I make sure I do is hold down the Shift key, and then as soon as I start painting, you'll see that I'm drawing everything in real time. So I think maybe we should circle around here, work its way over this side, maybe come up into these mountains, cross its way back here, and then end right there. Now what that's done is it recorded those strokes in real time so I can play them back in real time. So let's come back to our Effect Controls window. Let's just pull this back into the screen. And obviously we should then go back to the timeline and adjust the opacity of the layer so it's back to 100%. I'll just go back down there and drag that value up to 100. There we go. Because then if we come over to the Vector Paint controls here, we do have a composite option which says we're compositing at the moment in the original. What I want to do is say only, and that's going to show us just this stroke on that background. And then all I need to specify here is the playback. And at the moment it's just saying current frame, which won't give us an animated playback. If we choose animated strokes and then hit 0 for our RAM preview, you'll see that we're getting an exact playback of the strokes that I just drew in real time on the screen using a paintbrush for the Wacom. So it's a pretty nice little feature to be able to do this all inside of After Effects. And obviously if the playback speed isn't fast enough, we can very easily adjust that. Let's just click out of here. And you'll see here you have playback speed. Now this can be keyframes, so the playback speeds up and slows down, which is quite cool. I'm just going to click on there. At the moment it's 1. Let's maybe push that up to about 2.5. And again, hit 0 for RAM preview. Now the stroke will happen much, much faster. So there's other controls in here that we can play with, but I'm going to get onto that more when we start talking about writing on logos and drawing masks. But I just wanted to show you that as sort of one of the last ways we can quickly draw a line around the outside of a map. What we're going to do now is look at a very special kind of filter, which is for creating animated lines using audio. So let's go ahead and just close this composition down and come back to the project window and open this file, 04 audio waveforms. Let's double click that, and now let's try some different effects. Okay, if we look down in our timeline, you can see that we have two layers here that are hidden. We have one called audio waveform and one called audio spectrum. So there are basically two main filters that we can use to animate lines based on audio properties within this particular file. What I'm going to do is just get an audio preview. We have down in the very bottom of your timeline, you have a file called heartbeat.aif. So it's a sound file that I've imported and placed. And if I hit the period key on the keyboard, and we'll just do an audio preview, you can hear the sound of the heartbeat that's playing there. And we're going to use that to animate some lines based on the audio waveform properties in that soundtrack. So first we'll do it on an audio spectrum. So go down to your timeline. Layer 4 is audio spectrum. We're going to use that one. And let's just go across to the eye on the left-hand side and turn it on so it's visible. And obviously the layer is completely gray because we're going to add a filter to it. It's just a basic solid. If we come back up to the effect menu, again, let's go down to render and go across and choose audio spectrum. Now when I select that, the layer is automatically going transparent and we can see through it, but we also have this green dotted line here through the center of the layer. Now the audio spectrum palette that's come up is very long. There's a lot of options in here, so I'm just going to shorten this down so we can see it a little bit easier. So maybe take it above the line there. So there's a few options. Let's stretch it out and see what we can do with it. So the first thing it's asking us for is the audio layer. Which layer inside your animation do you wish to copy the audio from? Well, obviously go down and choose layer 8, which is the heartbeat AIF. That's the one we want. And the start point and end point are these points over here on the left and right side of the line that allow us to position it inside the comp window. Again, the reason we can't see them, we have the effect controls hidden. Shift Command H will bring those back. Okay, you see we have a mask in this layer as well, which we're going to use in just a second. But these points are now visible here, and I can just pick them up and drag them to a different location. It can be up or down, it can be wherever it wants. But this is the audio spectrum line that we are moving into a different location. So I'm just going to set this one up fairly basically at this point. Again, Shift Command T or Shift Control T to bring back the effect controls if you need them. And at the moment it says you want to follow a path. Well, I've got none chosen, so it's following just the line that we've got. Let's scroll down a little bit and adjust some of these options. Now, in order to make it easier to see here, probably the first thing I will do is go down and edit the color of it. So let's come all the way to the bottom here and we see we have inside color. I'm just going to click on that and go for a bright white in the center. You see the dots are a little more visible. And let's go to the outside color and maybe choose a creamy yellow. And let's go to the for that level there. Something like that. Okay, now these will become more visible when we start to affect their thickness, but just so we can see them a little bit easier to start with. Now if we come back up towards the top, first thing I'm going to do is adjust the frequency. Now what happens is it's going to take the frequency values from the sound clip that we have, and that's a fairly limited range of frequency. Because it's just a heartbeat, it's actually very, very low on the scale. At the moment we're telling it to recognize any sound between a low frequency of 20 and a high of 2000. So that means that the lines, when they pick it up, will not pick up very much, or they won't change very much, because they're having to try and keep control of too wide a frequency band. So what I'm going to do is take the start frequency up to about 90. I'm going to crank it up so it picks up the lower ends, but then the end frequency, I'm going to change that to about 100. So it keeps between sort of those two levels, which will allow me to get more sound in the line when I do it. Now if we want to, let's just hit the 0 key and do a RAM preview at this point. So first thing it does is it loads in the audio, and now you can see that the line is animating up and down on its own. And if I click, we'll be able to hear it at the same time. Okay, so we're actually getting this nice feedback here based on that particular soundtrack. Now a couple of other things we might want to do. The frequency bands are only set to 64 at the moment, so that's the number of dots we have. And because we have a RAM preview already, we can now scroll through that and choose a point where the lines are a little bit more visible so we can see what's going on. And then if I crank up the frequency bands, we can get more in there, okay? And I'm going to go all the way around to probably around 300. I actually want to get more of a solid effect in here. So you can either click and drag, or you can obviously just click on there and type in. Now the maximum height at the moment is 480. That's pretty high there, so I'm going to drop this all the way down, and that means how much they can actually vary between the frequencies that we get. So let's try that down here, something like that. Again, always just hit 0 and do a RAM preview at any point and see what's going on. So you see the line is now much more finely controlled. Okay, we're not having such extensive height to the line. Okay. And then a couple of other things we might also want to adjust is maybe the audio duration. At the moment it's kind of set to 90, which is a lot of audio content for it to connect to. So I'm just going to drop that down to 6. Our animation is 6 seconds long, so that's just going to shorten down the amount of audio time that we have to keep up with. And then obviously the final thing I really should drop down here is the thickness of the line. At the moment they're set to 3, which is one of the reasons we can't see through them. If we just scroll up here, we can see that. So the thickness, I'm going to drop that down to probably about 1, maybe even 1.5. But the softness, we can either drag it down or we can drag it up and make it harder in each direction. So either one of those settings, whatever you want to apply. Now another fun thing is down the bottom here, we have a hue interpolation option. At the moment it's set to 0, it means it's using the colors that we actually have applied. If I drag through that, you'll see the colors are changing on a radio spectrum basis, and this can be animated. This hue interpolation angle can be animated, and you'll see as I go through it and rotate more and more and more, the colors are becoming more and more saturated. So this is a really cool way to get some great backgrounds based on a soundtrack that you have in your After Effects file. So, play around with these things and get the results that you would like to achieve. And then right down the bottom, another couple of things you want to see. The actual display itself. We're getting a digital readout at the moment, which are these very straight lines that we preview. We can also get analog lines, which we're going to use in just a second. And we also have analog dots, which are basically just 2 dots, one on top of the other, and they will move up and down accordingly. So again, play around with these items when you want to try different things. We're going to go all the way back to digital. The last thing is side options. At the moment, we're viewing both sides of the line. So the audio spectrum is applied both sides of the line. You can choose to say side A. So the bottom of the spectrum stays the same, and the height bounces up and down. Let's do a quick preview of that. Okay, you can see the effect taking place there. And obviously we can go back and say side B, which will keep the top of it straight and bounce the lines down underneath. And obviously, as always, you have a composite on original, so you can drop it over the original layer that you had if you want to. That's pretty cool. What I'm going to do is just finalize this. I'm going to take my hue interpolation all the way back round to 0. Use the shift key to snap it in there, so I've got my original colors. And then I'm going to come all the way up to the top here and tell it to use a path, because we have a mask path here that I've copied and pasted into a layer. I can go ahead and just choose root, and that's now going to attach the audio spectrum around the outside of that path. And let's just go down the bottom, check one more thing, check the side options on both sides, A and B. So it's centered on that line, and I'll do one final RAM preview just to check that. We'll see it's animating. There's our stroke around the path, just kind of beating itself on and off to match the heartbeat. Let's preview this. Okay, so that's one way to do it. What I'm going to do quickly is look at the other option, which is audio waveform, and they're very, very similar. They do have their own little nuances that separate them, but they are very, very similar. So what I'll do is close this effects controls window down. I'm going to come down to the timeline, turn on the visibility for the audio waveform layer, and when I do, you can see that I have a mask on this layer that is showing transparency through. So it's kind of like a mountain profile we see here at the bottom. And what I'm going to do at the same time is turn off audio spectrum, so we're only viewing the one at the moment. Let's click on audio waveform to highlight it, and then let's go back to our effects menu, go down to render, and go across, and this time choose audio waveform. Now again, this appears as a line across the center of the composition, and what I'm going to do is just customize this one in a very similar way to what I did last time. So if I wanted to, I could move the points down or across to the left-hand side. I'm going to leave that as it is. Again, at the top, it says which audio layer do you want to use to get the sound from. So let's drop down there and choose heartbeat again. And then if we just scroll through the animation, you can see that we already have the audio values being copied into the waveform here. So let's just go to kind of a mid keyframe here so we can see all of our settings. Again, we can apply it to a path. I'm going to do that towards the end just so we can keep it in a line for now. And the number of displayed samples, basically the quality of the line that we have here. At the moment, it's set to 120. Which is pretty much the quality of this line. If I drag it this way, you'll see that I'm getting more segments or less segments. As I come this way, it kind of drops it down and we get a much more simple line in there. I'm going to leave it round about where it was, about 120, somewhere around that area. Again, the maximum height will control how much variation there is vertically based on the frequency of the soundtrack. So I'm going to drop this all the way down because we don't want it to vary too much from the shape of the mountains that we've got as our profile. So I'm going to bring this down to about 45, something like that. And that will just keep it a little bit more under control. Let's come down a little bit further and control the actual values of the stroke itself. So its thickness, the moment it's set to 3, I'm going to thicken that up to round about 13. And the softness, I want to make it as soft as possible up to 100%. So it's very much a glowing line. Come down a bit further and adjust the colors for this. So again, I'm going to go for a bright white center, like so. And then on the outside color, I'll choose a bright yellow. I do want this one to be very bright and punchy, which will make the line, see it stands out really, really nicely now. We can also choose the type of waveform, so we can take mono or the left and right channel values from the soundtrack. And also, again, we have display options as digital, analog lines, or analog dots. I'm going to leave that exactly as it is. The thing I do want to specify is composite on the original, so we see the mask and the audio waveform effect itself. And then let's scoot all the way back up to the top of the window here. And from our path option, choose the profile. And now that will attach the audio waveform over the top of the mountains. And if we hit the 0 key just to do a RAM preview, you'll see that the mask shape is staying the same as it is, but the audio waveform is just gently moving itself because we set the values down to around 40, 45. It's not varying that much and will actually give us just a little bit of sound effect. So let's just RAM preview that. And that pretty much finishes up the audio options. So you can see some pretty cool and funky ways to animate lines on your file, either through masks or through lines that you've created inside the filter based on the frequency of an audio soundtrack you have in the background. Some great functions. Go try them out and have some fun with them. We're going to look across now at writing effects. Now this is where we're going to play with some really cool features. So let's close the window down, close the composition down, and come down and open here 05 writing effects. Just double click that and now we can start to play with some different options. Now most of these options are going to be based around ways of revealing text, such as this 2003 graphic I have here. First one I do want to show you though is the ability to stroke a layer like this. Now at the moment we've gone through various options to see how we can stroke masks and stroke a motion path. Essentially right now there isn't a specific way to stroke a layer that you have inside of After Effects unless it has a mask around it, in which case you can then multiply layers and play around with some things that way. What I want to do is show you very quickly a technique that's used to add a stroke around the outside of this lettering, but it's a stroke that's actually going to get thicker from behind the lettering. So it's not going to appear on the edge, and as it gets thicker it will encroach on the yellow area. It's a stroke that will appear from behind. And it's called the Minimax technique. It's very straightforward. It's very similar to working inside of Photoshop. So what I want to do is let me just press Shift-Command-H. Let's bring all our edges back so we know exactly what we're working with. And then I'm just going to go down to my timeline. I've got this layer already highlighted, and I'm just going to press Command-D or Control-D on the PC to duplicate this layer. And you see I now have one on top of the other. And what I'm going to do is just click on the eye icon on the left side of this top layer just to hide it. So we're only working with the second one, just so you can see all the changes that take place as we go through it. What I'll do is just quickly select this, and we're going to apply two very simple filters to it to create our minimax stroke. So let's go up to the effect menu and go down to render, and we're going to use fill, which we have seen already. So just highlight that. And you see immediately my path is filled with red, which we can just go in here and adjust. Let's click on there and drop that down to black. I can leave it red, but for this specific instance, I want it black so it stands out against the yellow. And that's pretty much all I need to do. What I'm trying to do is say when I apply my minimax stroke effect to this, it's actually going to thicken based on the color of the layer. So that's why I've gone in here and changed the color to start with. That gives us a good ground. What I'll do is I'll just collapse that and go back to my effect menu, come down to channel, and then we go across to minimax. Now let me just select that, and immediately there are no actual changes to this. Now the minimax is basically the same as the minimum and maximum filters that you see in Photoshop that allow you to increase or decrease the thickness of a layer based on its alpha channel and it go in either direction. So this is working exactly the same way, but all inside of one filter. So here we have a choice. We can have maximum or minimum. Those are the two that I might decide to use. We'll stay on maximum for a second. And down here, it's very important that I choose the right channel. So we're not just going to affect the color channel. We want alpha and color. So it's alpha channel information is expanded, and then the color of the layer is taken with it. So if we then just go to radius and click and drag, you can see that my stroke is thickening up in the background and looks exactly as I want it to. Another small text effect here before we throw the original yellow layer back on top. If you go back to minimum, so we're going the other way, you'll see that the value of 6 we had has actually decreased the amount of visibility we have on the type. So if you actually start with a thicker stroke, such as around here, which is around 12, and then you keyframed it running backwards, you see you get a really nice reveal effect of the thickness of this layer coming into play. Okay. Now it's a little steppy because there's no decimal points in this effect. 3, 4, or 5, no individual ones. So you do need to make it happen over a longer period of time if you want to see that smooth. But I think that's a pretty cool effect and just one I wanted to point out whilst we were in there. So let's reset that back to maximum and just crank that up to 4 or 5, something like that. And then we can go back down to our timeline and turn on the visual properties for that top layer. So now the yellow layer is appearing on top. And then we can go back in and fine tune that radius to thicken up exactly what we need. So you see, this is a cool way to apply an outer stroke to a layer that's already been rendered here inside of After Effects. And it's just one of those really simple things to do. So I just wanted to point that out before we get onto the reveal options. So I'm going to close down my effects window, come back down to the timeline and just delete that layer we have in there. We're only going to be working with the original 2003 one. So now we're going to look at the way to reveal lettering or have it hand drawn in a way that we can see it here. And there's just a few techniques I'm going to highlight. The first one is using masks. Now we've seen already how to create masks and how to use them and animate them. And this is one of the initial fairly simple ways you can animate text to appear on screen. So again, we're going to be focusing on this layer only. So what I'm going to do is just zoom up to 100% in the comp window here. And let's go full quality. And just use my hand tool, that's the H key, just to pull that into place. And what we're going to do is just apply a reveal effect to this number 2, just to try the masking options. So what I'll do is just go back to my cursor tool, select that top layer so it's highlighted. You can see here in the timeline it's already selected. And what I'm going to do is come to my toolbox, let's move that in here, and use the Bezier pen tool to just start drawing a mask. Now it's one that's going to have to change shape over time. So I'm just going to draw a rectangular shape at this point, and you see it's now affecting the whole layer. It's masked itself out. Let's go back to the cursor tool for a second. Now what we're going to do is animate this just moving around the outside of the shape. And the way we're going to do that is obviously apply some keyframes to the mask shape. So back down here in the timeline, let's just hit the M key to give us our mask properties and the mask shape and just turn on its shape right here. So we've added a keyframe that will now allow us to go through and animate it. So we can do all this back inside the comp window. Let's go up there and just click in the center of it just to deselect the mask so then we can access its points individually. Now what I do want to make sure is that I'm obviously moving along the timeline a certain number of frames at this point. I can use my page up and page down keys on my keyboard, and the page down will allow me to progress a single frame at a time. If I use the shift key in conjunction with those, it will allow me to move 10 frames at a time. So I'm actually going to speed it up. I'm going to use the shift key and hit page down, which will take me to 10 frames along inside my animation. And you can tell that you've moved along because the border around the mask here has changed to suggest that it's in kind of a motion recording mode. And what I'm going to do is just pick up some of these points and start to move them around so we can see that mask begin to do its work. So over the course of the first 10 frames, I'll decide to maybe reveal this much. Again, use the shift and page down to move another 10 frames. And let's just start revealing different parts here. So what will happen is as we get towards the outer extremities of these paths, we do need to start adding points so we can sculpt them a little bit more. So I've reached that set there. I'm going to move another 10 frames, shift page down. And let's just pull this mask a shade more over here. But then what I'm going to do is go to my add point tool, which is over here in the toolbox, and just create another couple of points. If I then go back to the cursor tool there, I can then drag these down and start to affect the path in a different direction. So let's come down about there. So we've got 4 keyframes applied so far. Again, shift page down. Let's move another 10 frames along in the animation. And let's take this corner point here. And this one, again, because of the angle, we're going to need to go in and add a point. We can do this on the fly. It's really easy. Come down there. So we're working our way down. That'll be fairly good. Again, another 10 frames along. Just keep on moving this path around the outside until we get to where we need to be. So see how much further we've got to go there. Another 10 frames along. Drag this down towards the bottom. And we will reach a point here where it starts to turn around inside itself. So again, we're going to have to start adding some extra points to this. So once we reach this point, I'll go another 10 frames along. Go back to my add point tool and create another couple of points here that will allow me to sculpt the bottom corner. So we know we can pull out around about there. This one we can take to about here. Again, another 10 frames and just work it. So let's stick another couple of points, maybe just one more point in here for a second. Start to work our way along the bottom there. There we go, we're revealing quite well. I might actually just pull this one out a shade. Because don't forget we are moving 10 frames at a time here, which is quite a fair amount. So just move another 10. I'm going to add one more point to this and continue working my way up there, because now we've got all these extra points. I can pull this one back in this direction. I'll pretty much be able to follow that towards the end. So let's go another 10 frames and crank ourselves towards the end of this line, and then probably just another 10 frames and we'll finish everything off. Let's just go all the way out to this final point, pull that there, and I guess maybe just one more. Let's add another point in here, another point in here, and then we can just pull this one down to reveal that final section. Okay, so we've gone through, we've added a bunch of keyframes to this mask to be able to make it work. So if we go straight back to the beginning of the timeline at 0 seconds and start to work our way through, you see the mask is going along, changing shape accordingly, given the points that we created and the direction we pulled them in. And it's giving us a pretty good mask. It's actually changing shape in some places that we wouldn't expect. It's kind of messing around a little bit at the bottom here where we didn't have enough points. You see, I'd have to go back there and start making some changes. And then we come out to the end and it animates pretty well in that direction. Now you can see that it took a fair amount of time to do this one, and we would possibly still have to go through and do the other characters as well. This is a fairly lengthy process, so this isn't the easiest, but it's certainly good for many different reasons. Now another thing I could do is obviously to make this a little smoother is to feather the edge of the mask. I'm just going to press Shift Command H so we can hide the edges and just see what's left. And then if I hit the F key, that's going to access in my timeline the feather option. And if I just click and drag on this, you see I'm able to gently soften up the edge of that mask. We can see here on the edge of the 2. But you'll also see because the mask is fairly close to this bottom part, we're also fading out there. So even though you have control over that feather, if you don't construct the path shape perfectly, it is also going to encroach on other parts. But it still does a fair job. So for certain instances, this is a really good little feature. It's very easy to do kind of a rough cut around an object and then maybe use a matting function afterwards to tidy it up. So that's a good place to start. Let's take a look at some other ways that we can reveal the text on the page. I'm going to come all the way back to the very beginning of the timeline. I'm going to just click next to feather over here on the left just to deselect the mask, click back onto it, and then hit delete because I don't want the mask anymore. I want the original layer back. And then let's just change ourselves back down to 50% here in the comp view so we can see everything that's going on. Now the next way I want to play around with this is to take the original paths that I have here from Illustrator and apply a stroke to them, but then I'm also going to apply another filter and turn this text into smoke. It's a really cool little effect and very simple to do. So what I'm going to do is come across here to the project window and select this file 2003 strokes. That's the graphic we have on screen already. And then I'm going to hit Command E or Control E on the PC to go to Edit Original, and that will launch the file inside of Illustrator. Now once we're inside of Illustrator, you can see that I have the original brush strokes here, and they were drawn using the brush tool and also using the Cintiq Wacom screen because I just painted them directly on and then styled them up with a brush. But if we look at this in artwork mode, which is Command Y or Control Y on the PC, you can see that they are just basic strokes at this point. Now, those could be used for keyframe data inside of stroke, because don't forget we can use multiple masks when we paste it back into After Effects. Now, at the moment, if I did just drag across those and selected them ready to copy and paste over into After Effects, I would encounter a small problem. What happens by default is if this has a brush stroke applied around it, when I copy and paste it back into After Effects, that outer stroke, the one we see back here in color, is actually converted into a path, and we will end up with solid masks that contain color. I only want to copy these single paths. I don't want to copy the shape around the outside, and that's what will happen. So one thing I do just need to do is if I go to the window menu and show brushes, so this is my brushes palette, on the right hand side of the brushes palette I can go to the pop-up menu and choose remove brush stroke, and that will actually delete the preference of any brush stroke that's been applied to those paths, which now I can press Command C and copy them into memory, ready to paste them over into After Effects. So let's go back into After Effects, and in order to use these path shapes, I'm going to paste them down onto a new solid. Now, in order to apply a solid, you must make sure that the composition or the timeline are selected. We were in the project window before, so it won't let us use our shortcut. So just click in this window, bring the comp to the front. So I'm going to press Command Y or Control Y to access our solid settings, make it the composition size, say OK, and then simply paste those paths in. Now, at the moment I can't see them. It's because we have all our selection edges hidden still. So remember, Shift Command H, bring them all back again, and we can see the 4 paths that have been pasted in. So let's go up to our effects, go back down to render, and apply the stroke filter that we've used already. There we go. Let's pull that up here. Collapse the window down so we can see it. And we can obviously increase the brush size, get it to where I want it to be. I'm going to aim for somewhere around, let's go for 12. And obviously I want to make sure that all masks are stroked. And I'm not going to animate the length of the line on these. I want to leave it as it is. But like I said, I want to turn this into more of a smoky effect. So let me close stroke down, but I'm now going to add another effect. Again, under my effects menu, I'm going to go down to stylize this time and choose roughen edges. Now this will allow us to roughen the edge of a layer based on its alpha channel. Now at the moment, I won't see any particular change. I've got roughen applied, but I can't actually see the rough edge around here. Well, that's because it's roughening the alpha channel of my layer. This layer doesn't have an alpha channel in the background yet. If we go to the stroke option, scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that we're painting it onto the original image. I need it on transparent to be able to roughen the edge. And you see now I've actually got a roughened edge around the outside of this layer. Now that's great. That's exactly what I want to see to start with, but it's also getting fairly cluttered in here. So just zoom back down to the timeline and hit the solo button right here so we only view this layer on its own. And then if we come back, we can start to style up the roughen edges option. So let's collapse our stroke here so we can see it easier. And I'll pull it down to this side because it's a bit clearer to see what's going on here. So I'm not going to go through all the options here because we're going to use a couple of these a little bit later when we start doing our text effects. What I am going to do is just adjust a couple of these settings. So the border I'm going to set up to probably around about 25. I want it to be a thicker border, which is going to roughen up the edge here quite nicely. The edge sharpness I can increase or decrease again based on how soft I want that to be. Well, if I bring it down, you'll see the lower I go, the more puffy it gets. And let me just hit Shift Command H, just hide the mask there. You can see it's looking really nice, soft and fluffy kind of effect. The fractal influence, we'll see that a little bit more in detail later. But the scale is also very important, the size of the pattern that's inside here. So you see the larger I make it, if you go all the way up here, you can get some really nice sort of smooth kind of effects. Almost looks like there's a blur applied to this layer. Great for a very sort of haunted title sequence. If I drag all the way back down in the opposite direction, the smaller I go, the more sort of random and fractal this effect becomes. So I'm going to aim for somewhere round about the middle, for around 120, 125. Gives me just the right amount of smoke there. And then all we need to do is to animate the evolution. You see, as I drag through this and rotate, you'll see the smoke and the clouds moving within that layer. So let's go up to the top. Make sure in your timeline that you're at 0 seconds. Turn on a keyframe for evolution. Let's come out to 6 seconds along the timeline, move to 6 seconds along, and then just play with the amount of evolution we want. So I might just say, give me 4 overall rotations. If I just hit 0 now and do a quick RAM preview of that, we'll see the frames build up. You can see this really nice effect that's been very simply achieved using paths copied and pasted from Illustrator, stroked inside of After Effects, and had their edges roughened and softened using the Roughen Edges filter. Great way to create some wonderful effects with your type. What I'm going to do now is look at using the Write On filter again. keep this rough edge type, but I'm actually going to use a different process for this. I'm going to use an expression, which is JavaScript, to control that value for us. So I'm just going to quickly go through and create a basic layout again for my type. So let's just click to cancel all of that. If I come back down to the timeline, solid 1 is highlighted. I'm just going to hit delete to get rid of it. And we're now going to create another solid for our motion sketch. So let's come back up to the comp window. And one thing you do want to check before we add another solid is the time at which we are sitting in the timeline. I'm going to drag all the way back with my time cursor straight back to 0. If we create a new solid layer, it will be created from where our time cursor currently is. So we don't want to make it beyond the end of the animation at 6 seconds. So just check that before you do this. So I'm going to hit Command Y and create myself a new solid, and I'm going to use just 100 by 100 pixels, just a small layer for us to animate with Motion Sketch. Say OK, and then go to my window menu and access the Motion Sketch palette again, same as we did earlier on. And again, I'm just going to be using my Cintiq screen and pen for this. You can obviously use your mouse for the same function. I'm just going to make it very easy because I can paint directly on screen. I'm going to say Start Capture, and then just paint the numbers 2003 directly on the screen like so. Now, if I close the palette down, I can come back down to the timeline. Here's my solid. Let's hit the U key to access all the position data, and there's all my keyframes. So I'm just going to select position. That highlights all of the keyframes, which I can then copy into memory. And then if I have the layer selected, I'm just going to hit delete. That will first remove all the keyframes. Then delete again will remove the whole solid. So I'm going to create another solid for the right on effect. And this one, I'm going to make it the composition size. Wants to be full screen. Say OK. And then let's go to the effect menu. Back down to stylize, and all the way down to right on at the bottom. There we go. The effect has been added. And again, just to access our shortcuts like we did earlier for bringing the position data from another layer for brush position here, I'm going to turn on a keyframe, then zoom down to my timeline. Solid 1 is highlighted. Hit the U key to access its keyframes, turn off the brush position 1, and then paste in the position data that we just copied from our motion sketch layer. So if we look in the composition window now and just scrub through our timeline, we can see the stroke being drawn to the shape of the motion sketch path that we just had. Now I'm just going to affect a couple of options in here so it's fairly easy to see what's going on. So I'm just going to increase the brush size, take it around to about 10. And then I'm also going to decrease the brush spacing, which is here. It's set to 0.01. I'm just going to drop that down to the very minimum, which is 0.001. So we're not having any gaps around the outside. Now what I want to do, the reason I've done this is to show you that we can use a JavaScript expression to randomize the actual stroke properties here. We could obviously add multiple keyframes to do that for us if we just went through brush size and animated that, but we can use a script instead. It's a very easy function to do. Let me pull this palette out of the way. What we'll do is come down here to the timeline and access all the properties for this filter. So let's close that up and drop it down. We can see everything in here. Let's come back to the start. Okay, so we can see our stroke retracting. What we're going to affect is the brush size. At the moment it's set to 10, but I want to vary those properties using a script. Well, a very quick and easy way to add an expression to this property is to hold down the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and click on the stopwatch. Now, instead of adding a keyframe, it adds the expression for us. You can see here it says expression brush size. So what do we key in? Well, the effect I want to use is either a random or a wiggle effect, and I could use either one of those functions. The wiggle is going to be a little bit smoother. Random basically affects every other frame, so the effect could look a little bit ragged, but it's up to you if you want to use it. I'm going to use wiggle because it's just that slight bit smoother. So wiggle is actually a command that's recognized by the JavaScript function, so I can say wiggle this property, but in parentheses I can put the values between which I wish to wiggle. So at the moment you see that the brush size is set to 10, and that's kind of an average, so I don't want it to probably be less than 6. Put in a comma and then specify the maximum value. It's probably no more than about 11. So let's close those parentheses, hit enter, okay, and then if we come back to the comp window and do a preview, you can see that as the stroke builds, it's having this wiggle effect applied to it. Now it's varying itself across the width of the whole stroke. That's just the default option. Very similar to how we were playing with it earlier when we were doing the maps. We have to control the fact that the stroke thickness applies its change, but then stays static and the rest of the line gets changed. We're not having this constant animation like this. Now it works great if you're trying to do sort of neon lettering or something. This is a good way to get a random flashing value. What I want to do though is let's pull back the effect controls window here, come down to the brush time option, and we're going to tell it to respect the size controls. Okay, so when we specify different keyframe values through JavaScript for the size, it's going to respect that, and when the size changes, leave it static. So these size changes now in RAM preview can take effect, but you'll see that they stay exactly as they are. So now what we have, just by adding that very short line of JavaScript, we have a piece of lettering that looks so much more like it was hand-drawn, and we're also seeing it constructed at the same time. We're not having to do any very intricate masking effects or revealing effects. It was very simply drawn on screen using the motion sketch, and then one simple expression to pull out the more artistic side of that lettering and affect the stroke value. So this is just one of those really cool little features that can allow you to achieve so many different effects with just a couple of options. So you see the finished effect we have here is pretty much the lettering being revealed as it goes along. What we're going to do is kind of follow this line and go back to the original 2003 lettering, the Illustrator graphic in yellow, and show you one final way that you can reveal those letters. I'm just going to click to cancel all of that. Come back down to the timeline, use the H key just to scroll the window down, hit V for my cursor again. Solid 1 is highlighted. I'm just going to delete it because I want to get my original layers back. Now the 2003 strokes layer, this is the one that we are now going to animate because I want the 2003 to be revealed on screen. So I'm just going to select that, make sure it's highlighted. Come back up to my effect menu and go down to paint and across to vector paint, which we obviously used before. And again, I just need to set up a couple of preferences for the brush stroke. And obviously I'm going to be using the Wacom for this again. It's so much easier to paint on screen this way. So I'm going to hold down the Apple key or the control key on the PC and just select the size of the brush that I wish to use. And I need to base it around the thickest part of this line, which is kind of the tops of the letters here, maybe up there. So this gives me a fairly accurate scaling that I want the brush to be. Now the other thing I need to make sure is what speed and what sort of settings I have for when I'm painting the stroke, how it's being recorded. So let's come up here again and go down to Shift Paint Records. And I could either use in real time like we had before, or I can even choose continuously, which will allow me, as long as I keep the Shift key held down, to paint continuous strokes with small gaps in between. So I'm going to give this one a try. And then if we come back up and hold down the Shift key, I can then start painting. I'm going to work my way around this path. Let's come back up around here. So it's not recording this in real time, because then we can easily adjust it afterwards. Let's give ourselves a stroke around there. Okay, so we've drawn that path. Very straightforward. What I'm going to do is come back to the Effect Controls window now. Let's come up and just set a couple of options here. Obviously, the first one is to set the playback options to animate strokes so we see them play back. If you just want to scrub through your timeline here, you'll see that effect taking place. So there's the mask being drawn. And then obviously all we need to do is to set it as a matte, which is done down here at the bottom of the Vector Paint palette. At the moment it's set to in original, so we could have only, so we don't actually see the pixels underneath, we just see the stroke. The one that we want is we want to say as matte, and what that'll do is use itself as a reveal for the layer underneath. Now if you scroll through the timeline and just work our way towards the end of that animation, when I get to 6 seconds, you'll see that we've only got 2 of the characters fully drawn. That's because we also need to adjust our playback speed. So I actually want this to happen in just 3 seconds. So here's a nice little option. Come all the way back to 3 seconds on your timeline, okay? And then take the playback speed right here inside the effect controls and increase that until you've seen everything be drawn, okay? So it's round about, in this instance, around about 4.4, okay? And I can see the whole effect is now visible there. So I know now that that whole animation is going to take place from 0. It'll work its way around and end up perfectly timed to fit in with 3 seconds. And you can see that this option is very similar to the one we did to start with, where we were using masks in order to remove the contents of a layer and animate it coming back on. This is so much faster. It's been done in real time. I've done it with a paintbrush and painted directly on the screen to do it. And all I literally have to do at the end is say, please increase or decrease the speed of it. So you can see here, this whole lesson has been just created purely for animating lines. And we've done it in many different ways, from audio waveform. We've done some great stroke effects, write-on effects, used some nice filters for customizing our smoke and everything. So hopefully this has given you some great ideas to play with for something very simple as animating lines.